The morning mist clings to the Kansas prairie like a shroud, rolling across endless grassland that stretches beyond the horizon. It's September 1871, and the air carries the weight of approaching autumn, though the heat still presses down with an intensity that makes the earth shimmer in the distance. Somewhere in this vast expanse of tall grass and silence, 14 people have simply ceased to exist. Their names were recorded in the ledger at Fort Harker just 3 weeks prior. The Morrison family of 5, including twin daughters barely 8 years old. Samuel and Martha Chen, newlyweds from California seeking their fortune in wheat farming. The bachelor homesteader Jacob Mueller, a German immigrant with calloused hands and careful English, and 5 others whose dreams of prosperity led them into this sea of grass that now holds their secrets. But here's what makes this disappearance unlike any other in the annals of the American frontier. Their wagons were found arranged in 3 perfect circles, not abandoned, not ransacked, not burned or broken, arranged, as if by some deliberate, unknowable intelligence that left behind a message written in wood and canvas that no one has ever been able to decode. If you're fascinated by historical mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the past, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This case will take us deep into the heart of 1871 Kansas, where the line between civilization and wilderness was measured in heartbeats, and where 14 souls walked into legend. The Kansas Territory in 1871 was a place caught between worlds. The Civil War had ended 6 years earlier, but its echoes still reverberated across the prairie in the form of displaced families, discharged soldiers, and opportunists of every stripe. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres to anyone brave enough to claim it, and brave enough was often synonymous with desperate enough. The prairie itself was a living entity, vast and unforgiving. Tall grass stretched higher than a man's head in places, creating a maze of green corridors where sound traveled strangely and direction became negotiable. The wind never stopped, carrying with it the whispers of 100 different scents. Wildflowers, buffalo grass, the distant smoke of homestead fires, and something else. Something indefinable that old-timers called the smell of space itself. Kansas in 1871 was still largely unmapped territory where surveyors' lines existed more on paper than on the ground. The vast expanse between established settlements could swallow entire wagon trains without leaving a trace. Rivers changed course with seasonal floods. Landmarks disappeared in prairie fires, and what seemed like solid ground could turn to quagmire after a thunderstorm. It was a landscape that demanded respect and extracted a terrible price from those who underestimated its capacity for sudden violence. The weather patterns that September were unlike anything in recorded memory. Atmospheric pressure fluctuated wildly, creating sudden thunderstorms that would appear from clear skies and vanish just as quickly. The air itself seemed charged with an electricity that made horses nervous and set children's teeth on edge. Old-timers spoke in hushed tones about the way the light fell differently that month, casting shadows that seemed too long, too dark, too permanent. Local Pawnee guides, who had navigated this territory for generations, began refusing to travel certain routes without explanation. When pressed by military officials, they would only say that the earth was dreaming, and that wise men did not wake the earth from its dreams. These warnings would prove prophetic in ways that no one could have imagined. Fort Harker stood as an island of military order in this ocean of uncertainty, its wooden walls and structured routines, a comfort to the steady stream of settlers who passed through seeking supplies, protection, and the reassurance that civilization had not entirely abandoned them to the elements. Captain William Morrison, no relation to the missing family despite sharing their surname, maintained meticulous records of every wagon train, every family, every soul that ventured beyond the fort's protective shadow. Captain Morrison was a man haunted by premonitions he could never adequately explain. His personal diary, discovered decades later during renovation of his family home in Kansas City, reveals his growing unease during the weeks leading up to the disappearance. The very air seems to whisper warnings. He wrote on August 28, 1871, "I have learned to trust such whispers, though I cannot explain their source or their meaning." His logbook, preserved in the Kansas State Historical Society, tells us that the group of 14 left Fort Harker on September 3, 1871, bound for parcels of land roughly 40 miles northwest, near what would eventually become the town of Wilson. They carried standard homesteader supplies, plows, seed grain, tools, household goods, and enough provisions for the journey, plus several weeks of settlement life. Morrison's notes describe them as well-provisioned and of sound disposition, though his private diary reveals deeper concerns about their journey. "There is something about this group that troubles me," Morrison confided to his journal on the evening of their departure. "Not their character, which seems beyond reproach, but something in the air around them, as if they carry with them the weight of destiny, though whether that destiny be bright or dark, I cannot say." The Morrison family patriarch, Thomas, had served as a Union quartermaster during the war and possessed the organizational skills that made him a natural leader for the small group. His war service had taken him through some of the bloodiest campaigns in Missouri and Arkansas, experiences that had hardened him without making him cruel. Fellow veterans who knew him described Thomas as possessing the rare combination of practical competence and moral steadiness that made men willing to follow his leadership into uncertain territory. Thomas Morrison carried with him scars both visible and hidden from his military service. A Confederate bullet had left him with a permanent limp, while Confederate prisons had left him with nightmares that plagued his sleep years after the war's end. Yet those who knew him spoke of his unwavering optimism about the future and his absolute devotion to providing his family with the security and prosperity that his own childhood had lacked. His wife Elizabeth represented the backbone of frontier resilience that kept families intact when lesser bonds would have shattered under prairie pressures. Born in Pennsylvania to a family of German immigrants, she had learned early the value of self-reliance and the necessity of maintaining hope when circumstances seemed hopeless. Neighbors who knew the family before their westward journey spoke of Elizabeth's skill with herbal medicine and her ability to stretch limited resources through sheer ingenuity and determination. Elizabeth Morrison possessed an unusual gift for understanding people and their motivations, a talent that had made her the unofficial counselor for wives struggling with the hardships of frontier life. Her letters to relatives in Pennsylvania, preserved by family members, reveal a woman of deep intelligence and remarkable emotional strength, who saw the westward journey not as escape from civilization, but as an opportunity to help build something better. Their children embodied the future that drew so many families westward, despite the obvious dangers. The twin girls, Sarah and Rebecca, were described by their teacher in Ohio as bright as new pennies and twice as curious, possessing the kind of intelligence that thrived on new experiences and unfamiliar challenges. At 8 years old, they had already learned to read and write with a proficiency that impressed adults, and their letters to friends back east revealed remarkable maturity and thoughtfulness. Sarah Morrison was the more outgoing of the twins, quick to make friends and eager to explore new places. Rebecca was more contemplative, often found reading books that were considered advanced for her age. Yet both girls shared an infectious enthusiasm for their family's westward adventure that helped sustain their parents' spirits during difficult moments of preparation and departure. Their older brother Michael, just 14 but already showing the lean toughness that marked successful homesteaders, had inherited his father's organizational mind and his mother's practical resilience. Michael Morrison had spent the summer before their departure working alongside his father to prepare for the journey, learning skills in wagon maintenance, animal care, and basic survival that would serve him well on the frontier. Michael possessed a quiet maturity that impressed adults who met him, yet retained enough boyish curiosity to find excitement in the prospect of adventure. His journal, which he had begun keeping at his mother's suggestion, contained detailed observations about the journey preparations and his hopes for their new life in Kansas. The final entry, written the night before their departure from Fort Harker, expressed confident optimism. "Tomorrow we begin our new life. I am ready." Samuel and Martha Chen represented something relatively rare on the 1871 frontier, a Chinese-American couple seeking agricultural land rather than mining claims or railroad work. Samuel had spent 3 years working the California gold fields before marrying Martha, a Chinese immigrant who had arrived in San Francisco as part of the small but growing community of women brave enough to cross the Pacific for a chance at American prosperity. Their decision to pursue farming in Kansas marked them as either remarkably forward-thinking or remarkably naive, depending on one's perspective. Samuel Chen's experience in the goldfields had taught him patience, persistence, and the importance of long-term planning over quick profits. He had saved enough money to purchase quality farming equipment and seed stock, and his letters to relatives in California revealed detailed plans for crop rotation and soil management that demonstrated serious agricultural knowledge. Samuel understood that success in farming required different skills than success in mining, and he had spent months preparing for the transition. Martha Chen brought to the partnership skills in household management and textile production that would prove invaluable in establishing a successful homestead. She had learned English with remarkable speed, though she retained enough of her native language to maintain correspondence with family members in China. Her letters reveal a woman of quiet determination and practical intelligence who viewed the Kansas venture as an opportunity to establish a legacy for future generations. The Chen couple faced additional challenges beyond those confronting other homesteaders. Anti-Chinese sentiment was common on the frontier, and they understood that their success would depend partly on their ability to integrate into communities that might view them with suspicion or hostility. Their decision to travel with other families reflected their understanding that isolation would increase their vulnerability. Jacob Mueller carried with him the dreams and desperation of thousands of German immigrants who saw the American prairie as their chance to own land that had been impossible to acquire in their homeland. His English was careful and precise, learned from a German-English dictionary he kept wrapped in oilcloth in his wagon. Those who met him remembered his extraordinary height, well over 6 feet, and hands that spoke of years working soil that had never belonged to him. Mueller's background included apprenticeship to a master farmer in Bavaria, where he had learned agricultural techniques that were generations ahead of typical American frontier practices. His wagon contained carefully preserved seeds for crops that might thrive in Kansas soil, along with hand-copied notes on soil management and crop rotation, written in a mixture of German and heavily accented English. Fellow German immigrants at Fort Harker had pooled resources to ensure Mueller's success, viewing his venture as a test case for their own eventual westward movement. Jacob Mueller possessed an almost mystical connection to the land, an understanding of soil and weather patterns that seemed to transcend mere technical knowledge. Other farmers who worked with him spoke of his ability to predict weather changes days in advance and his uncanny skill at determining the best times for planting and harvesting. This intuitive understanding of natural rhythms would make his disappearance even more puzzling, as it seemed impossible that someone so attuned to the land could simply vanish without trace. The other 5 settlers remain more mysterious, their individual stories lost to time and incomplete records. What we know comes from fragments, a surname here, an occupation there, ages estimated rather than recorded. They were part of the great anonymous river of humanity that flowed west in the decades following the Civil War, seeking something better, something different, something that the settled East could no longer provide. Among these 5 were the Hendricks brothers, William and James, bachelor farmers from Tennessee who had pooled their resources to claim adjacent parcels. Their Confederate service had ended in Union prison camps, experiences that had left them eager to start fresh in territory where their war records would matter less than their willingness to work. The brothers shared a fierce loyalty to each other and a practical understanding of farming that complemented their determination to succeed. A widow named Mary Caldwell traveled with her teenage son Robert, carrying the deed to land inherited from a brother she had never met, but whose death in a farming accident had provided her only chance for independence. Mary Caldwell possessed the kind of quiet strength that sustained frontier communities, and her son Robert showed promise of developing into the kind of capable young man that the frontier desperately needed. The 14th member of the group was Dr. Hiram Wesley, a former Army surgeon whose struggles with laudanum addiction had cost him his practice in St. Louis. Wesley's inclusion in the group reflected the complex social dynamics of frontier settlement, where communities often welcomed individuals whose personal failures might have made them outcasts in more established societies. His medical knowledge and surgical skills were valuable enough to override concerns about his reliability. Dr. Wesley carried with him both the burden of his past failures and the hope that frontier life might provide the fresh start he desperately needed. His medical bag contained instruments and supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for isolated homesteaders. And his letters to former colleagues revealed his determination to rebuild his reputation through service to his new community. The weather during their first week of travel was unremarkable for early September in Kansas. Yet those who observed their departure noted subtle atmospheric anomalies that seemed to follow the wagon train. Days were hot, nights carried the first hint of autumn's approach, and afternoon thunderstorms provided both relief and challenge as wagon wheels struggled through mud that dried to concrete hardness within hours. The prairie during this season was at its most deceptive, appearing almost pastoral during the gentle morning hours, then revealing its harsh character as the day progressed. But there were signs, if one knew how to read them. The wind patterns seemed wrong, shifting direction too frequently and carrying scents that didn't belong to the season. Birds flew in formations that defied their usual behavior, and domestic animals showed nervousness that experienced handlers had never seen. The very air seemed charged with potential, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. Contemporary weather records from Fort Harker show that September 1871 was notable for its atmospheric instability, with barometric pressure fluctuations that suggested weather patterns unlike anything in the fort's 6-year record-keeping history. Military meteorologists, a specialty that had developed during the Civil War, noted unusual cloud formations and wind patterns that seemed to move independently of normal pressure systems. The group's progress during their first week followed typical frontier patterns while leaving behind subtle traces that would later prove significant. Early morning starts to take advantage of cooler temperatures, midday stops during peak heat, and careful attention to water sources and grazing opportunities for their animals. Letters written by Thomas Morrison to his brother in Ohio, carried back to Fort Harker by a returning supply wagon. His edict, he described the journey as proceeding according to plan, while noting certain atmospheric peculiarities that bear watching. Their route took them through territory that had been surveyed but not yet settled, following wagon traces that connected seasonal water sources and avoided the worst terrain obstacles. The path they chose was well known to experienced travelers, marked by rock cairns and blazed trees that served as guideposts for subsequent wagon trains. This familiarity with their route would later make their disappearance even more puzzling, as experienced trackers found it inconceivable that an entire group could simply vanish from such well-traveled territory. By September 10th, they should have reached their destination. Military protocol required wagon trains to report their safe arrival to the nearest fort within a reasonable time frame, and Captain Morrison began to feel the first stirrings of unease when no word came from the group. By September 15th, concern turned to worry among the small community of settlers and military personnel who tracked the movements of homesteader groups. By September 20th, Captain Morrison organized the first search party, driven by both official responsibility and personal unease that he could never adequately explain. The captain's decision to mount a search operation was influenced by reports from other travelers who had passed through the area where the Morrison group should have established their homestead. These reports described an unusual silence in the region, an absence of the normal sounds and signs that indicated human habitation. Even more disturbing were accounts of atmospheric disturbances that seemed centered on the area where the settlers should have been building their new lives. The search party that departed Fort Harker on September 21st included 12 men, 6 soldiers under Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, 4 civilian volunteers with extensive frontier experience, and 2 Pawnee scouts whose knowledge of the territory was unmatched by any white inhabitants. The group carried supplies for 2 weeks and equipment for establishing signal fires that could be seen for miles across the flat prairie landscape. Sergeant O'Malley was a career soldier whose 20 years of frontier service had taught him to trust his instincts about danger and disaster. His personal account of the search, written years later for his memoirs, describes a growing sense of wrongness as the party approached the area where the settlers should have been found. "The very air seemed to resist our passage," he wrote, "as if we were pushing through invisible barriers that grew stronger with each mile." What those searchers found on September 22, 1871, defied every expectation, every precedent, every logical explanation that frontier experience could provide. The approach to the discovery site began ordinarily enough. The search party crested a low rise approximately 38 miles northwest of Fort Harker, following wagon tracks that had remained clearly visible despite several days of moderate rainfall. Sergeant O'Malley's report, filed with military precision 3 days later, describes the moment of discovery with the kind of clinical detail that makes its emotional impact even more powerful. At approximately 11:47 a.m. on September 22, 1871, O'Malley wrote, "Our party achieved visual contact with the missing wagon train. What we observed defied immediate comprehension and continues to challenge rational explanation. The wagons stood in 3 perfect circles on a section of prairie that offered no natural explanation for such precise arrangement. The largest circle contained 6 wagons, positioned with mathematical precision that would have impressed a surveyor, each wagon tongue pointing toward the center like spokes of an enormous wheel. The second circle, slightly smaller, held 5 wagons arranged in identical fashion. The third circle, the smallest, contained 3 wagons, completing a pattern that seemed both deliberate and impossible. But the circles themselves were only the beginning of the mystery. Every wagon remained intact, as if placed there by careful hands, rather than abandoned in panic or haste. Canvas covers showed no sign of violence, no tears from arrows or bullets, no evidence of fire or storm damage. The wheels were properly positioned, the tongues arranged with geometric precision, the entire arrangement suggesting deliberation rather than accident. Supplies remained largely undisturbed inside, though inventories would later reveal curious inconsistencies that only deepened the puzzle. The precision of the arrangement became even more apparent upon closer examination. Military surveyors brought from Fort Harker confirmed that each circle was geometrically perfect, with wagon positions accurate to within inches of mathematical precision. The spacing between wagons was uniform within each circle, and the orientation of each wagon tongue toward the center was exact enough to satisfy the most demanding engineering standards. Such precision would have required surveying equipment and mathematical knowledge that the missing settlers did not possess. More puzzling still, the arrangement would have taken considerable time to achieve, yet there was no evidence that the settlers had established even a temporary camp in the area. No fire rings, no waste trenches, no signs of the normal activities that marked human habitation, even for a single night. The horses were gone, all of them, not dead, not scattered by predators or thunderstorm, simply absent. No bodies, no bones, no traces of the 43 animals that had pulled these wagons across the prairie. Search parties found no tracks leading away from the circles, no signs of struggle, no evidence that the horses had ever existed beyond their absence. The missing animals represented one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire mystery. 43 horses, oxen, and mules could not simply vanish without leaving some trace. These were large, heavy animals whose hooves left deep impressions in prairie soil, whose waste would have been evident for weeks, whose bodies would have attracted scavengers from miles around if they had died naturally or been killed by predators or hostile humans. Experienced trackers examined every inch of ground within a mile radius of the circles, searching for any sign of the missing animals. The Pawnee Scouts, whose ability to read tracks bordered on the supernatural in the estimation of white observers, found nothing that suggested the animals had ever moved away from the site. It was as if the horses had simply ceased to exist at the exact moment their wagons were arranged in circles. Personal belongings told a story that made no sense. Clothing remained neatly folded in trunks and saddlebags, as if the settlers had been preparing for an extended stay rather than fleeing from danger. Cooking utensils were clean and properly stored, suggesting normal camp routine rather than emergency abandonment. Children's toys sat precisely where loving hands had placed them, untouched by weather or disturbance. Yet certain items were missing in patterns that suggested deliberate selection rather than random theft or loss. All cutting implements had vanished, knives of every size and purpose, scissors, razors, even the small penknife that Michael Morrison had received for his 14th birthday. Every reflective surface was gone. Mirrors, polished metal plates, even Martha Chen's small hand mirror that she had treasured since her journey from China. All rope and cordage had disappeared. Wagon ropes, clotheslines, harness leather, even the shoelaces from boots that remained otherwise undisturbed. Most mysteriously, every piece of written material had vanished. Letters from distant relatives, personal journals, business records, even Jacob Muller's carefully guarded German-English dictionary. The selective removal of these items suggested intelligence and purpose, but purpose directed toward goals that made no sense within any known framework of human motivation or need. The missing written materials particularly puzzled investigators, as these items would have had little value to robbers or hostile Native Americans. Personal letters contained no information useful to anyone outside the family. The German dictionary would have been meaningless to most Kansas residents. Yet these items had been specifically sought out and removed, while valuable jewelry and money remained untouched. Weather patterns added another layer of impossibility to an already inexplicable situation. The prairie around the wagon circle showed clear evidence of recent rainfall, with dried mud patterns and water-carved channels visible in the soil. But the ground within and immediately around the circles remained completely dry, as if some invisible barrier had protected these specific areas from precipitation that had fallen everywhere else. The weather phenomenon proved to be ongoing rather than a single occurrence. Subsequent rainstorms throughout the autumn of 1871 produced the same effect. Precipitation would fall normally on the surrounding prairie, but would not penetrate the circular areas. Snow behaved identically, accumulating everywhere except within the three circles, creating stark boundaries that made the preserved areas even more visually striking. Temperature measurements revealed another persistent anomaly that challenged every known principle of meteorology. The air within the circles registered consistently 5 degrees cooler than the surrounding area, regardless of weather conditions, time of day, or seasonal changes. Military personnel with thermometers designed for precise weather observations confirmed this temperature differential repeatedly. Finding it remained constant, whether measured in the heat of midday sun or the chill of pre-dawn darkness. The search for the missing 14 people expanded rapidly, drawing volunteers from homesteads across the region and eventually involving military personnel from 3 different forts. These searchers combed thousands of acres of prairie, following every creek bed, investigating every natural shelter, pursuing every possible explanation that experience and imagination could suggest. Search efforts were organized with military efficiency and civilian determination. Fort Harker became the coordination center for an operation that eventually involved over 200 people, including soldiers, civilian volunteers, professional trackers, and Native American scouts from multiple tribes. The search area expanded in concentric circles from the wagon site, eventually covering over 500 square miles of Kansas prairie. Teams were assigned specific grid sections to ensure complete coverage of potential hiding places, burial sites, or evidence of struggle. Progress was reported daily to Fort Harker, where Captain Morrison maintained detailed maps showing which areas had been thoroughly investigated and which still required attention. Yet despite this massive effort, despite the expertise of the searchers, despite the systematic coverage of vast areas of prairie, they found nothing. No bodies, no graves, no signs of struggle or violence. No indication that 14 human beings had ever walked away from those wagons or been taken from them. The prairie, which typically revealed its secrets to those who knew how to read its signs, offered only silence. The absence of any trace was perhaps more disturbing than discovering evidence of violence would have been. Death on the frontier was common enough that communities had developed rituals and procedures for dealing with such tragedies. But complete disappearance without explanation challenged fundamental assumptions about cause and effect, about the relationship between actions and consequences, about the basic reliability of physical evidence. Native American tribes in the region were questioned extensively, both through official military channels and informal civilian contacts. The response was universal: bewilderment. The Pawnee, who knew the area intimately and maintained generally peaceful relationships with white settlers, had no knowledge of the missing settlers and no explanation for the wagon circles. Their own oral traditions contained no precedent for such an arrangement, and tribal elders spoke of the site with visible unease, describing it as a place where the earth dreams strange dreams. The Kansas tribe, for whom the territory was named, had similar reactions. Warriors who had tracked enemies across hundreds of miles of prairie, men who could read stories in bent grass and shifted stones, examined the circles and admitted complete bewilderment. One Kansas elder, speaking through an interpreter at Fort Harker, described the site as, quote, "a place where the sky touched the earth, and left marks that men should not try to understand. Even tribes that had been hostile to white settlement expressed genuine confusion about the circles. Cheyenne representatives, contacted through intermediaries during a temporary truce negotiation, indicated that the arrangement violated natural and spiritual principles that governed their understanding of proper relationships between human beings and the land. The universal bewilderment among Native American communities, regardless of their political relationships with white authorities, suggested that the circles represented something outside all known cultural frameworks. Investigation of potential human causes proved equally fruitless. No outlaw gangs in the region possessed the organizational capability or motivation to arrange such an elaborate scene. Robbery would have involved taking valuables, not creating geometric patterns. Kidnapping for ransom made no sense given the random nature of the victim selection and the absence of any subsequent demands. The criminal element on the Kansas frontier in 1871 was well known to military and civilian authorities. Outlaw gangs typically operated with predictable patterns. They robbed travelers, stole livestock, and occasionally raided isolated homesteads. But their actions were motivated by immediate material gain and characterized by speed and violence designed to discourage pursuit. The careful arrangement of wagons and the selective removal of specific items bore no resemblance to any known criminal behavior. Confederate irregulars still active in some parts of Kansas had no interest in elaborate psychological warfare against random homesteaders. Union forces had no reason to harm civilians, who posed no threat to military operations. Local vigilante groups, focused on cattle rustling and claim jumping, lacked both the sophistication and the inclination for such complex operations. The precision of the wagon placement suggested planning and coordination that ruled out spontaneous violence or panic-driven abandonment. Each circle was geometrically perfect, with measurements taken by military surveyors confirming mathematical accuracy that could not have been achieved by chance or haste. The level of organization required to create such precise arrangements would have demanded considerable time, multiple participants, and careful planning, none of which fitted any known pattern of frontier conflict or criminal activity. As autumn progressed and search efforts continued, other disturbing details emerged that added new dimensions to the mystery. Local wildlife avoided the area entirely, displaying behavior that veteran hunters and trappers had never witnessed. Birds would not land within or near the circles, despite the presence of scattered grain from the wagons that should have attracted them in large numbers. Domestic animals brought to the site by search parties became agitated and refused to approach the wagons, displaying panic that experienced handlers could not explain or control. The animal reactions proved consistent and universal. Horses that had been calm and manageable throughout the journey to the site would become increasingly nervous as they approached the circles, eventually refusing to move forward despite encouragement from riders they trusted completely. Dogs that normally investigated every new scent with enthusiasm would stop abruptly at an invisible boundary and retreat with obvious distress. Even insects seemed to avoid the area. Military personnel noted the absence of flies, mosquitoes, and other pests that typically plagued prairie travelers during late summer and early autumn. The lack of insect activity was particularly noticeable given the presence of scattered food supplies and organic waste that should have attracted swarms of various species. The grass within the circles had stopped growing. Not died, not withered, simply stopped. Blades remained at exactly the height they had reached when the wagons were discovered, while grass surrounding the circles continued its normal seasonal cycle. Botanical experts from the State Agricultural College examined soil samples and found no chemical or biological explanation for this arrested growth. The grass preservation became one of the most scientifically intriguing aspects of the mystery. Soil analysis revealed no differences in mineral content, moisture levels, or organic composition between the circle areas and the surrounding prairie. Seeds planted within the circles by investigators would sprout normally, but then cease growing at precisely the same height as the existing grass, as if some invisible ceiling prevented further development. As 1871 turned to 1872, the mystery deepened rather than resolved. The wagons remained exactly where they had been found, untouched by weather, undisturbed by animals, unchanged by the passage of time that transformed everything else around them. Wood showed no signs of weathering, despite exposure to Kansas winter conditions that regularly destroyed inadequately protected structures. Canvas remained unmarked by sun, rain, snow, or wind. Metal components showed no rust or corrosion despite constant exposure to moisture and temperature fluctuations. The preservation of the wagons defied every known principle of materials, science, and environmental chemistry. Wood that should have cracked from repeated freeze-thaw cycles remained smooth and sound. Canvas that should have faded, torn, or rotted maintained its original color and integrity. Iron and steel components that should have rusted in the humid prairie environment remained bright and functional. Local homesteaders began to speak of the site in whispers, creating new routes that avoided the area entirely. Cattle drives were rerouted to bypass what became known as the Circle Ground, even when such detours added days to the journey. The pragmatic, down-to-earth frontier community, accustomed to dealing with harsh realities and practical problems, found itself confronting something that challenged every assumption about how the world worked. The practical impact on local travel patterns was significant and immediate. The site was located along one of the primary routes between Fort Harker and the developing settlements to the northwest, but travelers increasingly chose longer alternative paths rather than passing through the area. This avoidance behavior was particularly remarkable given the frontier community's usual disregard for superstition when it conflicted with practical necessity. Religious leaders struggled to provide explanations that would comfort their congregations without admitting their own bewilderment. Some spoke of divine intervention, though whether benevolent or wrathful remained unclear. Others suggested demonic influence, though the complete absence of violence or obvious evil made such interpretations problematic. A few proposed that the missing 14 had been taken directly to heaven, though this raised uncomfortable questions about why such salvation would be accompanied by such disturbing earthly manifestations. The religious response to the mystery reflected the complex spiritual landscape of frontier Kansas. Multiple denominations were represented among the settlers, each bringing different theological frameworks for understanding miraculous or supernatural events. The absence of clear religious symbolism at the site made it difficult for any particular faith tradition to claim the circles as validation of their specific beliefs. Scientific minds of the era proved equally baffled. The few educated men who examined the site could offer theories but no explanations that withstood careful scrutiny. Geological surveys found nothing unusual about the ground composition. Astronomical observations revealed no celestial events that might account for the phenomena. Weather records showed no anomalous conditions that could explain the selective preservation of the wagon circles. The scientific investigation of the site attracted attention from educational institutions across the Midwest. The University of Kansas sent a team of researchers who spent 2 weeks conducting measurements and collecting samples. Their final report, published in the university's scientific journal, concluded that the phenomena observed at the Circle Ground represent either measurement errors of unprecedented consistency or natural processes that current scientific understanding cannot adequately explain. Today, more than 150 years later, the fate of the 14 settlers who vanished from the Kansas Prairie remains unknown. The circles they left behind have become part of local folklore, part of American mystery tradition, and part of a growing catalog of historical events that resist explanation despite extensive investigation and analysis. Modern technology has added new layers of data to the mystery without providing resolution. Electromagnetic readings within the circles show consistent anomalies that have no known natural cause. Ground-penetrating radar reveals underground formations that appear to be artificial but cannot be excavated without destroying the very phenomena that make the site unique. Atmospheric analysis confirms the persistent temperature differential and adds the discovery of trace gases that exist nowhere else on Earth. The wagon preservation continues to baffle materials scientists who have studied samples of the wood, canvas, and metal components. These materials show no signs of chemical treatment or artificial preservation, yet they resist decay processes that affect identical materials elsewhere. Molecular analysis reveals nothing unusual about the basic composition, yet the aging process appears to have been suspended in ways that current science cannot explain or replicate. The human stories behind the mystery remain equally compelling and equally unresolved. 14 individuals, each with their own hopes, fears, and dreams, walked into legend on a September morning in 1871. Their names are remembered, their personal belongings are preserved in their abandoned wagons, and their fate remains one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries. The disappearance of the 14 Kansas settlers represents more than just a missing persons case or historical curiosity. It stands as a reminder that despite our scientific advances and our confidence in rational explanation, the world still contains mysteries that humble human understanding. On a stretch of Kansas prairie where grass waves in the eternal wind, 3 circles of wagons wait in perfect formation, preserving questions that have outlasted generations of investigators, and may outlast many more. In the end, perhaps the greatest mystery is not what happened to the 14 settlers, but what their disappearance reveals about the limits of human knowledge and the persistent possibility that reality contains depths we have not yet learned to explore. The circles remain, the wagons endure, and somewhere in the vast silence of the Kansas prairie, 14 souls have left behind a puzzle that continues to challenge anyone brave enough to confront the possibility that the world is stranger, more complex, and more mysterious than we dare to imagine.